Okay, UConn, the Huskies, repeating as national champs. Let's talk title game. I want to talk about the game itself, some of the things that happened, and then I want to talk a little Hurley, and then we'll talk a little draft stuff as well as it relates to this matchup. So UConn repeats for the first time in men's college basketball since Florida did it 06-07, and then prior to that it was Duke in 91-92. So this does not happen a lot. Last year's Open was a UConn championship. And I spent a great deal of that time talking about the history and me going to those Big East games and watching them get their doors blown off by everybody. And then talking about the location and UConn being a blue blood in comparison to these other great campuses and awesome towns and all that stuff. And I don't need to do that again because I got to come up with something else anyway. Like, hey, Russillo, we got it. Stores isn't exactly St. Bart's. That's fine. But let's start with the game. The headliner, clearly Edey, the matchup against Clingan, the way it was built on CBS. So I think as far as like the headline players, the first time in the title game, you had two 7-footers going up against each other since Patrick Ewing against Hakeem Olajuwon in 84 when Georgetown beat Houston. The one title for Ewing during that ridiculous run of tournament runs that Georgetown had under John Thompson. So there's probably another game where there were two 7-footers playing against each other, but I wasn't going to go back and look up every single roster to see how tall every guy was the last 40 years. So the first thing I'm looking for is Edey and how he sets up in the post, how much of a priority it is, and then ultimately, like, can Clingan hold up and not get into foul trouble? I counted, and you could probably find a different tracking of this. I was looking at not just touches for Edey, but like the deep post catches and then the working off the post, where he was incredible for much of the first half in this game. And I had it at 9, and clearly that's the priority. Get it down to him, let him go to work. I'm sure Purdue was just dying to get Clingan into foul trouble. He got into foul trouble later in the game, but at that point it didn't really matter. But in the first half, he held up well, and it was terrific. And they only had to cover him with one guy because UConn and Clingan had the one thing all these other teams didn't have. It's really hard not foul Edey, because whether it's his size or getting his arms into you, you got to get straight up. But the second he goes to a counter, when he had that up and under where he wants to turn left shoulder, but he got Clingan going back to his right, like that's just, I can't even fathom, even at 7-1, how brutal that must be to have to deal with. So then I was wondering if UConn would go small with their backup center in Johnson, which they did do. Johnson is really good on these lobs. He got 2 where he got behind Edey, but he also fouled out in 5 minutes. Speaking of the challenge of trying not to foul this Purdue team. The thing that worked for Purdue that was really good was their point guard, Smith, who wasn't very good in the semifinal game. 2 backcourts is not what you'd expect out of your point guard leader. He was the only other play giving Purdue anything, but they do a really good job of setting the first screen. So whether it was right to left or left to right, where they would try to get the first defender off of him, whether that was Castle, who's a terrific defensive player as a freshman, as we've seen through this tournament. And then the next move would be bringing Edey up for a second screen, and then Smith is driving, where Smith has a little Chris Paul in him, in that he would get past the first line of the perimeter defense and then kind of know where he wanted to go and then maybe veer off to the side of the elbows and then pull up. And if you can get that shot down, that can save the mid-range, kids. That can save the mid-range. But if it weren't a pull up there, Smith would continue down with a lot of force, just getting downhill. He made some nice layups off of this. And then, of course, you had Edey trailing this action, where then Edey either gets a deep catch or then he had that big finish over Clingan where he just went right up over everybody. So that was the thing that was kind of working. And then it didn't, just because you knew, all right, well, we've got to try to fight through the first screen, or we're going to switch it better. Or in this case, like, let's also it gets you in this tough spot where you're guarding kind of 2 with 1, but then that means the other guy has to at least come over and try to disrupt some of the Edey part of it. I also thought Edey got tired in this game, and we'll cover that up here in a second. So Castle, I thought everybody did a better job with that Smith stuff that they were trying to do. This was also, as much as we were wondering about Clingan against Edey defensively, this is a very different game for Clingan on offense, where he just wasn't the same guy he'd been the last couple games. 18 points against Bama, 22 of 10 against Illinois, when Illinois clearly was trying to hope to get him into foul trouble, and instead all he did was just humiliate everybody that tried to go at the rim against him. So that part of the story was like, oh, wait, what's going on with UConn's offense? Well, this thing that has been an incredible go-to with drives and deep cuts and dump offs to Clingan. Like none of that stuff's going to happen with Edey, because whatever we think about Edey defensively and what he projects at the NBA level, in college, when somebody's 7'4" and just kind of standing there, it's going to make you think differently. And just that size alone is impeding so many of the other things that we've seen Clingan be able to do offensively here for UConn. The main problem in this game, the main problem for Purdue was that the others were non-existent. All right. And that's because UConn rarely doubled Edey really until a little bit later, especially when they had to go with that run without Clingan because of the 4 fouls. But for the most part in this game, and look, the Purdue players said it after the fact, like all of those shots that have been there all season because everybody has to double Edey, UConn didn't have to double. They stayed straight up. If Edey's going to score 1,000,000 points, that's fine, but none of the rest of you guys are going to be involved, and that's exactly what happened. And by the way, are you not only not doubling Edey, the perimeter players for UConn are all like, whether elite in Castle, but also like at the very worst, it's serviceable. Cam Spencer, there's going to be some TJ McConnell comps, which is a huge mistake because TJ McConnell's an absolute motherfucker on defense, and Cam's not that. But Cam is somebody you can trust for 40 minutes. He's not going to screw up. He's a little bigger than you think at 6'4". I wouldn't say he's at Pajemski level, like, holy shit, that guy got that rebound. But he's in there impacting all these different things. He just makes the right play every single time. I know he's 24. I know he's been around forever. But I think Cam Spencer has a chance to be a rotation guy in the NBA, but he's going to get compared to TJ because there's smaller white guys, even though he's bigger than TJ is. All right. So that was the problem. So at half, it's 36-30. UConn leads this one. Purdue played 9 players, 7 players at 3 points or less. 5 players had 0 points. So these shots that are open all season because of the double, they just weren't there. That was really the story of the game. So we go to the second half, and Edey on the game ends up with 37 and 10. But I thought he was tired to close the first half, and that carried over even after the break in the second half a little bit. I think he went like the last 5 minutes of the first half without a field goal, and then he didn't have his first second half field goal until about 6+ minutes in. He had 17 points the last 9-16, but at that point, the game was kind of over. They'd been down 16 points at that stretch, and then he added all those points. So you go, all right, well, 37 and 10. He was awesome. He scored 17 of them later. And look, he was the only thing they could really rely on other than the Smith stuff that we talked about already. So this game is not on him whatsoever, but that 37 will jump out historically. But man, he had 37 in that one. A lot of it was kind of late when I think UConn just knew that this game was over. I thought it was weird during the broadcast where Raph and Grant Hill were, I think they brought it up multiple times where they kept talking about like UConn's offense struggling. And every time they do it, you're like, yeah, but they're winning. And again, that's not to say that you can't watch a team struggle and then you just have to say, well, I guess I'm not right because the score is the score. But UConn's offense wasn't really an issue, or maybe they're just so used to these guys flying around against other teams, they were expecting the same thing to happen or not having the Clingan option that we've already covered. So this was a game where I'd say, I don't know, 10 minutes to go in the second half, you're like, this thing's over. It's not going to matter. Like there was a part with Clingan with the 4 fouls where I was like, should they just keep him in? But then if he gets that 5th foul, does that inspire hope in these guys? Or if they take him out, does that inspire hope in Purdue? Then they had to go to Caravan as a small center. But at that point, that's what we've already talked about with Edey closing with all these points. But UConn just has a bunch of different stuff that they can go to, even if they don't have the prototypical like NBA prospect off the dribble kind of scorer. It's just a smart, really tough basketball team that was dominant throughout this tournament. They finish as a +40 in point differential in the tournament. That's the best in tournament history. Hurley, I imagine if you go up against him, you can't stand him. Every one of you would love him to be your program's head coach. He feels like he's related to Jim Calhoun somehow, where it's like me against the world type of shit with him. And you can tell with the way these guys played, and it even was apparent to me when I saw him live against Stetson where they're destroying him, and everybody was playing like it was a tie game when they were up huge. Like, guys can talk about wanting that, but it's a lot harder to actually get everybody to buy in. And the standard that he has set, whether it's through history, whether it's the certain kind of guys that he's trying to recruit, they respond. They respond to whatever it is that he's doing. And that team is a bunch of fighters. And Cerruti was saying, like, it's funny because you think about how Calhoun carried himself. Like, there's some real similarities there with Danny Hurley. And think about this UConn run. They beat Illinois All right. Illinois in that game, it was tied 23-23. Illinois went 50 real minutes not scoring a point. All right. It went from 23 to 53. Illinois' first points were at 12:39 in the second half, and that was against the number 13 team in the country. So let's talk draft a little bit because we know it's a bad draft. People have been talking about it being a bad draft for a really long time. As we've already seen, there's little tidbits being like, this draft isn't as bad as everybody says. That will happen more, I promise you. Clingan's gone from late lottery to, I think I saw him on ESPN as the third pick in this draft. As good as he is, to really succeed, and maybe I shouldn't say like, to be worth the third pick in the draft, you have to be all these things. Well, if you're the third pick in this draft, it's probably a little bit different than being the third pick in other drafts. And I loved watching him this year, but there's no shot really to build on. He took 8 threes. So does he have to hit threes in the NBA to be like a guy valuable of this kind of, worthy of, I should say, of this high of a pick? It'd be nice. But he's also 56% from the free throw line for his career. So that's a little alarming because you go like, if he's in the 70s, then I got something to work with. That's what teams will tell you all the time. But you don't have that with him. And then you go, okay, is he good enough defensively? I think at the rim, the defense is really good, but they're going to move him around and move him out. And I thought Alabama showed some times where it got a little predictable, where if they got Clingan on one side of the drive, he was just always going to retreat. He wasn't going to go out and contest. So I thought that there were some more opportunities for Alabama in that game. But it looks like he's going to go like top 5 here. Now, Edey's a first rounder. No question. He's worth taking him somewhere in the first round. Just go, hey, you know what? Like, if we're going to be wrong, let's be wrong with him. Let's give him a chance. Maybe there's a way we can use him. But I think the problem is against specific matchups, he's going to be a liability defensively. He just is. I mean, there's big guys that are guys getting minutes now. They're still liabilities. I don't know if it'll get to the Enes Kanter phase where once Kanter was completely exposed and switching into pick and roll, it was just over for him. He thinks he's not in the league for other reasons. I would argue that it's his defense on switches. So with Edey offensively, it might not be about Edey's defense when we're talking about him as a prospect. It might be about, well, what's he going to be on offense and how's the team going to use him? I thought in the NC State game when he was getting doubled more, like some of the doubles, he made some nice passes, and some of the doubles, I didn't love the way he reacted to it all the time. I wouldn't say he's incapable of figuring that part of it out, but there was still at this stage of his career some stuff that I didn't like seeing. But it's more about, as I already talked about, like, how would you use him? Because you're just going to, what are you going to do? Run post-ups in today's NBA? You're going to get him down on the block and run your offense that way? Even if he's coming off the bench. I mean, how many touches is he actually going to get? And he's terrific at it. All right. But if you look at the way the game is played today, let's share some numbers here. Using the tracking data from Second Spectrum, Jokic leads the NBA in post-ups per game. The number's 8.2 post-ups. Now, his are weird. They're not just straight traditional post-ups, and he kind of catches it from all over the place. So the way this tracking data works, like legit, hey, back to the basket, catch, post-up, right? We all know what we're talking about here. So they're being very specific. They're not just giving you like an elbow catch, touch, pivot thing. I don't think they're counting that kind of stuff. Embiid is at number 2 with only 5 post-ups a game. He's more of a catch and face guy. Catch, turn, face, then do his work from there. Get Embiid, catch free throw line without a double, forget it. Just put 2 on the board. The game has changed. 10 years ago, our main man, Al Jefferson, led the NBA with 20 post-up touches a game. 20. That's only 10 years ago, 13-14 season. 20 a game. Dwayne Wade averaged 3.2 post-ups per game. That would be 11th in the NBA today. We have 11 players this season getting 3 or more post-up touches a game. 10 years ago, it was 60. So even if you like Edey and you go, all right, defensively, We're going to have to protect him. We can't expose him in certain ways. There's going to be nights where he gets attacked. And maybe, have to take him off the floor. We didn't think he was going to be our guy starting at center for 30 minutes a night. But what are you going to do with him on offense if nobody's doing any of that stuff that he's really good at right now? It was a weird tournament as far as the NBA projected talent. As bad as this draft is, there's going to be a couple guys that none of us really realize, and we do a bad job, and they end up being terrific NBA players. Like, you're not going to go 0 for 30 on the first round. But if you look at some of the projected lottery guys, Dillingham, Reed Sheppard were gone with Kentucky, lost to Oakland. Dalton Knecht was incredible for Tennessee, 37 against Purdue in that Elite Eight game. He's projected as a lottery guy, a little bit older, been around. Cody Williams, Colorado, he was barely a factor in the tournament despite them winning a couple games. Walker at Baylor, they lost in the second round. UConn was Stephon Castle. I've talked about his defense. He was great offensively against Illinois. You get a couple threes from him, you're stealing. I'm not even sure UConn needed Castle to win another title. That's how good everybody else was. Before Clingan had this rise here, there was some stuff projecting Castle to be going higher than Clingan did. And that's saying something. Because if you're telling me they're at one point best NBA prospect, now second best NBA prospect is somebody they didn't even need, and that's just my opinion. He certainly helps, but I'm not sure they even needed him. That's how dominant this run was for UConn this year.